afternoon session. One quick general comment is that I'd like to ask for speakers during this week to try to leave some time for discussion, because we really want to get more interaction. And yeah, I can give you warnings at whatever timing you want. Yeah, but like leave a little bit of time in your talks for discussion, and we can have more of that. We'll also have more again this afternoon. Okay, so with that, let's welcome Bruno Olshausen, who will be talking to us about geometric reasoning and neural basis of that.
Okay, thank you. I'll take. I don't need that. Okay, use this microphone here. Great. Okay, well, thanks very much. It's great to be back at Simons. We organized Christos Papadimitriou and I organized Program and Brain and Computation here back in 2018. Several familiar faces, Manuel and Dan Gusfield and many others from that time. So it's good to be back. So I'll just begin by introducing the folks I'm working with. And so first of all, the Redwood Center for Theoretical Neuroscience here at Berkeley. For those of you here at Berkeley, we're no longer in Evans Hall, thank goodness. We're now in Warren Hall, which is just cat a corner of the campus at the corner of Oxford and Hurst, close to Bear. So please come by and visit. So I'll just use this to introduce the folks who really took a heavy hand in this work. And first and foremost is Chris Kim, who's here importantly because he'll be able to answer many of the questions that come up, hopefully on residue number systems. And then his co-conspirators, Pentti Kanerva, Sonia Mazellet, an intern from France working with us, Fritz Sommer, another PI in the Redwood Center, and Anthony Thomas, postdoc in our group. So since the theme of this workshop is trying to bring together different ideas from these different fields like biology and psychology and computer science, I thought it'd be useful to go back more than 100 years to a time when people were also trying to gain inspiration from biology to build machines, to do certain things, and to build specifically flying machines. So people at that time understood the gliding principle. They were very successful at building gliders. Otto Lilienthal in particular took huge inspiration from birds and the shapes of bird wings and studying them and trying to emulate those. And here's a picture of his glider. He could sort of glide down a hill. Many people were successful at doing that. The thing they could not do was turn. That was the really hard unsolved problem of that time. And so one of the Wright brothers' innovations was being able to twist the wings to stabilize the plane in flight. And the way they figured out how to do this was by watching birds. So one of the things they noticed about birds when they turn is that they twist their wings. And so Wilbur Wright reasoned that when they do this, perhaps it applies more friction in the angle they're tilting towards to prevent them from falling out of the sky. This was the problem that all these gliders faced. The minute they tried to turn the angle of the plane, it would just simply fall out of the sky. So he reasoned that might be it. And so he tested this idea by building a kite, first of all, where he could twist the wings in that way. That worked. They implemented it on their airplane, and that worked. And that was the key innovation that enabled them to succeed where other people had failed. And I think what's interesting about this story is that the reason why they were able to utilize this insight from biology is because they were trying to solve the same problem that biology had solved. They were confronted with the same problem. They had to sort of puzzle about it and figure out the solution in the same way that, well, not in the same way, but evolution had already figured out a solution to this problem. So at the same time they succeeded in building a plane that could turn, they also figured out why it is that birds twist their wings. So they learned something in both directions, okay? Because they were confronted with the same problem and trying to solve the same problem. So the question is, are we at that point today with AI and neuroscience, the biology of the brain? Are we in AI trying to solve the same problem that biology has solved? So here's one way of looking at that. Here's where AI is now. Living in huge data centers. This happens to be the supercomputer just up the hill from us here, the NERSC supercomputer, which consumes 5 megawatts of power. And the building that houses it is nearly the size of a city block. This may as well be a stand-in for many of the data centers around the world right now that are running a transformer and neural network models as we speak. So this is, and these models are largely sifting data off the internet, as Shiri talked about this morning. Finding patterns in data and figuring out how to synthesize patterns that emulate this kind of data, generative AI. On the right is what biology built. So this happens to be the jumping spider, which has a very sophisticated visual system with 8 eyes, shown here. 2 of these forward-looking eyes have very high-resolution optics, so that's because of these long tubes. But the lenses are attached to the exoskeleton, and they focus the image onto a one-dimensional retina, which is the back of that eye. And then they take these tubes and scan and move them back and forth inside the head, so as to take this one-dimensional retina and kind of scan it across a limited region of the visual field. You can see that happening here in this one-day-old jumping spider, where the exoskeleton is still translucent enough that you can see through it and see that happening. Okay, it has eyes on the side of its head that are monitoring things in the periphery, so that when it sees something of interest, it turns the high-resolution eyes towards it, figures out what it is. It does distance estimation for jumping at the prey. That's one thing that differentiates them from spiders that build a nest, is they don't build a net. Spiders that build a web, they don't build a web. They rely entirely upon their visual system to localize and capture prey. Okay, so this animal does all kinds of amazing things. It does pattern recognition. It can do 3D navigation. It can do social behavior. It has these amazing, they have these amazing courtship dances, so forth. And it's all doing this in this very tiny form factor and very, very low energy budget. And I think it suffices to say that it's a huge explanatory gap here in terms of our scientific understanding in neuroscience today, and how it is we can do this, okay? But this seems to be solving, biology seems to have solved a very different problem here than the problem we're solving today. And so how did we get here? And this is one way of sort of maybe picturing maybe the trajectory of a lot of the model development in the field is, here we are down here in the lower left-hand corner with current models, or whatever time we are. And many of us, myself included, were marching upward on this trajectory of functional competence, with the idea of like, I just want to get my model to work. And if I can just get it to work, I can always worry later about making it more efficient. Okay? I can maybe perhaps scale it down, make the data representation more efficient, make it less power hungry and so forth like that. But that's sort of a later consideration. But I'll first kind of get it to later. So I'm sort of like, the idea is let's march up this direction, and then we'll maybe eventually march to the right. Meanwhile, another approach has been marching purely to the right and saying, okay, well, I'm going to try to emulate the designs of biology, understand things like spiking neurons and why they're efficient, and building hardware that does that. But it's been sort of difficult for these models to sort of realize the same kind of functional competence as models that are not taking into account those considerations. And so it seems that biology didn't do that. Biology didn't kind of march up this direction and then move over that direction. It just kind of went straight from here to here. And what I'm going to suggest here is that maybe what this suggests is that in the design of our algorithms and the design of the data structures that are running these systems, that they have to be intimately intertwined with the physics of computation. So the Turing model of computation by design is divorced from the physics of the computation. Okay, you can implement the computer with rocks, you can implement it with transistors, it doesn't really matter. So the idea is you have a whole abstraction that's divorced from physical reality. When the conclusion many people in the electronics community are coming to is that we can't do that anymore. Okay, if we want to move past Moore's law, build very tiny devices that work at low power, small form factor, we're going to eventually have to confront stochasticity. And this is one of the same problems, interesting, that biology had to confront in designing neurons to signal in the brain, to work with very low voltage levels, very small devices in a small amount of space, and to compute efficiently and to compute reliably in the face of that kind of hardware. Okay, so I think that's kind of maybe what's driving a lot of the work in our lab right now, is trying to sort of think about moving along this diagonal direction and thinking about the data structures and the computations at the same time we think about the physics, the biophysics of how those are actually implemented, and thinking of those at the same time. Okay, so the approach we're taking in the lab is really based on three kind of, I sort of maybe think of pillars, if you will. And the first is from animal behavior. So this really defines the problem landscape by looking at what animals do. For example, in vision, what are they doing with their visual systems? How do they use their visual system? What did vision evolve for? Okay, that defines the problems that we're trying to solve. And then to figure out, well, how is that done? We can look inside the brain and ask, well, what kinds of biophysical mechanisms are available to it? Okay, what are the computational primitives that brains actually use? Carver Mead at Caltech was always fond of saying, listen to the silicon. So his philosophy in analog VLSI was to say, well, let's look, well, what is the physics of semiconductors? What does it naturally do? One of the things it naturally does is it implements exponential current voltage relationships. And so he figured out how to exploit that natural primitive of the semiconductors to do computation very efficiently. Okay, similarly, evolution had to sort of listen to the biophysics. So what are the things that cells naturally do with their membranes? And so that's what we're going to show a few examples of. And then thirdly, look at the mathematical structure of the problem. So just look, in terms of the problems we're trying to solve, envision what kinds of mathematics helps us solve those problems. How can those problems be well posed mathematically, and what kinds of solutions do those offer? And so we'll see some examples of that using Lie groups, using high dimensional vectors, and using residue number systems. Okay, so that's the approach I'm going to try to tell you about today and walk you through a specific example of that. Okay, so let's first begin with animal behavior. So back to the jumping spider, one of the interesting things that people observed about their behavior is that when they see a prey item they want to capture. So if we got something like a fly on a lure up here, the jumping spider sees it from down here, and if it's too far away to directly jump at, then it has to sort of walk to get within range so it can jump to it. And one of the things they noticed that it does in the wild on the way towards walking to it is they do these kind of reorienting turns, as though to check, is it still there? And importantly, the angle that they turn at is the correct angle given their new position relative to the object. So they wondered, well, how does it do that? Is it kind of like keeping track of it in its visual field or something, or is it maintaining an internal representation of where it is out there in the world? And it seems to be doing the latter, and this was determined in controlled experiments where they have the jumping spider on a 1D track here. They start at this position here. They put the prey item somewhere in this ring, and so initially it's at this angle, and they let it move down this track, but the track has walls on it, so they can't really sort of track it in its periphery. But then there's a gap here where it can sort of see, and so when the animal does turn to it, they can compare the angle that it turns at compared to the correct angle for the object. And as you can see here, there's a pretty good alignment. Okay, so it's as though the spider seems to sort of be maintaining some representation, as though it knew all along where its goal was, where its target was that it was trying to capture. We just heard this morning from Shimon Ullman about desert ants, this amazing phenomenon where when they go to forage for food, they start at the nest here, that's N, and they do this kind of meandering, this sort of random walk, searching for food. When they finally find a food source that's marked F here, they want to go back to the nest and tell all the other ants about it, but they don't just kind of follow the same meandering path back, they take this straight line, beeline path back to the nest, as though they knew all along where the nest was. How do they do that? These things have for a long time been a mystery to people studying animal behavior. And that mystery seems to dissipate somewhat, at least in my mind, from this amazing recent discovery of the ellipsoid body in the central complex of the fly. So these head direction neurons have been known for a long time in mammals to exist, but people didn't know they existed in fruit flies. So deep inside the brain of the fruit fly, there's this ring-shaped body called ring-shaped nucleus called the ellipsoid body. It kind of looks like a donut here, and has approximately 40 neurons connected together in a ring. And what this is from experiments from a Genelia from Vivek Jayaraman's lab, where they were able to image with calcium imaging the activity of the neurons in this ring. And so what you can see is from the neurons in the population of this ring, there's basically a bump of activity that's indicating the fly's internal representation of where it's heading in the world with respect to an allocentric reference frame in the external world. It's not doing this through any kind of magnetic sense. This isn't aligned with magnetic north. What it determines as the reference frame is going to be sort of somewhat arbitrary depending on each environment. When it goes into a new environment, it lays down a reference frame and stays consistent with that. Okay, so just by reading out this bump of activity, the position of that bump, you can do a very good job, decoding. Sorry, okay, you can do a very good, okay, that was being shown here, is you can do a very good job decoding the actual position of the fly, and that's being shown on that over here. Okay, so the yeah.
So in what you described, there's one, it's keeping track of
one point, say the origin. But now let's say, it started off from somewhere, found the source of food, it's heading back.
Yeah.
Encounters an obstacle. Now it's got to keep track of two points, the origin as well.
Well, this isn't maintaining so much a representation of its goal, but just where it's heading. I think of it as that people think of it as just like its internal compass.
No, I understand.
Okay. Yeah.
I understand.
Yeah.
In everything you described so far, it needs to remember one point. Were there any experiments to see whether
it's not so much remembering one point. It's indicating where within this world it's. Yeah. Okay.
That's what I need to
Yeah.
remember.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I see. Yeah. 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 Okay.
But now, if there are two points it's interested in, its origin, the destination,
Yeah.
and because it needs to remember both in order to see how to get back.
Right. I mean, yeah, exactly. It gets complicated, I'm sure. The person to ask is Yvette Fisher, actually, here at Berkeley. She studies exactly this nucleus here, and is relatively new hire here at Berkeley, and we should ask her that question. So I'm a neophyte at this myself, but it's just a fascinating phenomenon, and they're trying to determine exactly this. How does it sort of reset the bump here? What cues in the environment is it using to do that, and things like that. But suffice to say, there's no external sense it's using for heading, right? There's no external signal that tells it that. It has to build this internal representation by bringing together many different sensory pieces of information, vision, its own proprioception, how it's flying, and so forth. Many different signals have to come together to create this explicit internal representation. It's just a mind-blowing phenomenon that you can sort of peer inside the brain and see this internal representation explicitly being formed in a ring, no less. Okay. And using a ring attractor neural network, which I'll talk about in a moment. Okay, so that's flies and ants and spiders. What about humans? We do equally amazing things. And if you ask most people, how do you see? They might say something. Well, my brain is looking at the image on my retina, or something like that. But this is what the image on your retina looks like. So each of these dots here is a cone photoreceptor, like the pixels of your retina. So this is going back to the fovea now, and this is an E just being flashed in the retina. And the reason why it's moving around is because even when you're fixating, your eye is still moving, largely because of drifts, fixational drift. Okay, so this drift is always there, even when you're trying to hold your eye still. This E is about the same size as the letters on the lowest row of the Snellen eye chart, which you can read with 20/20 vision. Okay, so you can see that, you can make out the E and see its strokes and so forth, just barely enough to see it, but you can see it. Okay, so the miracle is, how do you do that? Because this is what the sensor array looks like. Even more vexing is the fact that these different photoreceptors come in different wavelength selectivities. Okay, so it's basically changing color, if you will, depending on which photoreceptors it lands on. Okay, so if that was a green E moving around, so on your retina, then what the brain has to solve is essentially a factorization problem, how to take all this time-varying sensory data and factorize it essentially into representation of the shape, of the color, and the motion. Okay, so this is a factorization problem. So this is another very important geometric problem to solve in perception, in terms of piecing together some model of the world, of what's out there. This is another example of forming models of the world and how we do that. This is just an example of structure from motion of these dots attached to an imaginary 3D cube. And what you immediately perceive here is two things. You perceive a rigid 3D cube, and you perceive an axis of motion, a three-dimensional axis of motion. But there is no cube, and there is no 3D axis of motion. All there is a bunch of 2D dots moving around. So this is just taking the same dots and scrambling their positions. Okay, so that's basically what your brain is confronted with. It's just a bunch of 2D dots moving on a 2D screen. And from that, you create this internal representation somehow, factorizing these two things apart. Okay, so what I'm trying to argue here is that this is a very fundamental ability that we humans have, which we share with our ancestors, to geometrically reason about the world from sensory data. And so what it gives us is two basic problems come out of all this observations of animal behavior. One is, how do we extract and how do we represent transformations? And I'll call that the equivariant part. Okay, so the way things are changing. And so, for example, that would be like the ellipsoid body in the fly that's forming that bump of activity that's keeping track of where it's heading in the world. And then how do we extract invariances? How do we factorize apart the invariant part, like the shape of an object or the color of an object, from the specific instantiation, the very time-varying instantiation it has on the receptors? Okay, so these are kind of flip sides of the same coin. Solving these two, they kind of goes together. So these are the problems we want to figure out how to solve computationally. Okay, so what are the computations that the brain offers to us to do that? One is dendritic nonlinearities. So this is just a picture of a typical kind of pyramidal cell in the brain. And if there's one thing we've learned from neuroscience over the past century, it's that an individual neuron in the brain is not a perceptron. It does not compute a weighted sum of inputs and then apply a threshold to that. In fact, that's probably something that would be hard for a real neuron to do. It'd have to sort of cancel out all the natural biophysical nonlinearities that live on the dendritic tree. So any given neuron in the brain is getting bombarded with about 1,000 different inputs from other neurons. And locally within these dendritic compartments, inputs combine nonlinearly, maybe sort of pseudo-multiplicatively. Okay? And this is due not just to passive properties in the membrane, but also active processes which are known to exist on the dendritic trees. So taking nonlinear combinations like multiplying signals together or approximately multiplying things together is something that brains can naturally do. That's a very basic biophysical primitive that neural computation offers you, biological neural computation offers you. Another is recurrent computation. So this is just a wiring diagram from Rodney Douglas and Kevin Martin from their so-called canonical microcircuit, just showing for any part of cortex the recurrent loops that exist in there. And so one of the most powerful ones is in layers 2 and 3. There's this very powerful recurrent loop where excitatory neurons, neuron A connects to neuron B, and neuron B connects back to neuron A. Not specifically, but sort of, in general, these circuits have very powerful recurrent loops. And this is really ubiquitous throughout the brain, and especially found in cortex. Okay, so this is oftentimes a computation that's avoided in neural networks, maybe because you have to sort of let a system like that settle to find a solution, for example. But what we see here is that what this system really is more natural is like a dynamical system. Okay, that's the sort of natural way it works. It's not really like an information processing pipeline or a filter cascade passing information from A to B to C to D, but something where information comes in and circulates around. It's a very natural kind of computational primitive, computing with dynamics. And a third is oscillations in phase coding. So this is another sort of phenomenon that's been found in more areas of the brain now, where first of all, just about everywhere in the brain, neurons are oscillating. There's an ongoing oscillation of some kind. And one thing people have found is that these neurons in the hippocampus, the timing of their spikes relative to the ongoing phase of oscillation encodes information. For example, it tells you here information of an animal relative to a place field. Okay, so the timing of a spike relative to a phase of oscillation conveys information. And so computing with things like phasors, which we're about to do, I'm kind of preparing for that. This is something that that brains can potentially use as a computational primitive. Okay, so what about the mathematical structure? Let's go back to that example of the E moving across your retina. Think of that. Here's just an example of that E on a 10 by 10 pixel array, a specific pattern. That pattern corresponds to a point in a 100-dimensional space, assuming this is a 10 by 10 pixel image. So that E is a pattern that's in a 100-dimensional, it's a point in a 100-dimensional space. Okay. If we move that E to another position on that array, then that's a different point in this 100-dimensional space. Okay. And so now, what about when it's halfway in between? Is it halfway in between these 2 points in this 100-dimensional space? And of course, because we're in the Simons Institute, we all know that the answer is no. It lies on a point off that line, because if it was on that line, that would just correspond to the superposition of these two patterns here. Okay, so basically the answer is that as the E moves across this array of sensors, it's moving along a nonlinear manifold in this space, a low-dimensional nonlinear manifold in this space. And in fact, it's moving along a circle in this case. Okay, so this is a very important part of the mathematical structure of the problem to understand. What does math tell us? What it tells us is that we can get from any point along this manifold to another point on the manifold through a matrix transformation. Okay? And the matrix that takes me from this point to this point is different than the matrix that takes me from this point to this point. But all of these matrices that take me to different points along the manifold belong to the same group. They're called a Lie group. named for Sophus Lee, who figured this out. And so the amazing thing about this, that Lie group, that space of all matrices, is described by this matrix exponential. So there's a single matrix A that describes all the matrices that move you along the manifold. And this one-dimensional parameter T just simply says how far you're moving along the manifold. Okay, so this is an important part of the mathematical structure we can leverage and sort of to figure out how the brain solves this problem potentially. Another, I think, lesson here by writing this out is that another important problem that emerges is factorization. So note that at any given point along this manifold, this matrix here times this initial condition. So as I take this E and move it across that image, that moves along one manifold in this space. If I had a different letter, like the letter B, or the letter B, moving across that image, then that would correspond to a different manifold in this space. But the remarkable thing is that the same transport operator, the same matrix, the same Lie group that takes me along this manifold is the same one that takes me along the B manifold, or the C manifold, or any other shape that's on the retina. Okay, so once I've learned this matrix A, I can apply it to any other shape. Okay, so the important problem that I face is a factorization problem. So given that I'm on some point in this manifold, I want to know which manifold am I on? That would be something like X naught, and where am I? Okay, that's the parameter T, or what's the operation? What's the transport operator that's moving me along different points of the manifold? Okay, so this idea of factorization is also very fundamental, a computation of perception. So here's just one way of sort of schematizing this. If we're looking at an image of something in the real world, we can think of this then as a product of all these different factors out there in the environment that are going on. This is like the compositional structure of the world. We have shapes, we have axes and sort of transformations that are undergoing, different colors they can appear in. And then these things combine at any given instant. We experience some image of that. And the job of perceptual inference is to work backwards and recover these factors of variation out there in the world. Okay, so the world gives us the product space of all these different factors. That's what we're being bombarded by, the product space. What we experience is the factors. Okay, what we experience perceptually is the factors. When you look at that cube that's rotating with all the dots, you're experiencing the factors. Another perfect example of this is from Ted Adelson and his famous cube in two shades of gray here. And so when you look at this cube, what your brain is just immediately and automatically doing is factorizing that into these two fundamental causes. One is due to the reflectance, the paint on the cube, and the other is due to the shading, which is due to the three-dimensional geometry, how these different facets are oriented with respect to the light. Okay? And in this case, it's kind of interesting. You can enumerate it. Okay, you have two different shades of gray in terms of reflectance. You have three different shades of gray here being generated by the geometry of the object. And these two things literally multiply together to generate the image, which is going to give you, in general, 6 shades of gray. But Ted cleverly arranged this to create an illusion. I don't know if Ted is here, but okay. So cleverly arranged this so as to create an illusion. So there are actually only 5 shades of gray in this particular image, but in general there would be 6. Okay, but the idea is the same, right? So the idea is that the world is throwing at you the product space, and your brain takes that product space and factorizes it into its constituent components. And what you experience perceptually is the factors. Okay, so this maybe this is a kind of a short summary to say we've made progress on both of these problems. And so on this problem of, first of all, learning these different factors, and also in terms of using Lie groups and showing that we can learn these Lie groups from data in an unsupervised way. And also on the factorization problem, so the mathematics of how we can solve that problem, factorization problem very efficiently. And what I want to focus on here is just talking about the equivariant part. And so maybe should I just take a time check here? Okay, the whole session. Okay, so so I will try to zip through this pretty quickly. But basically, one of the lessons we've learned through this work is that using these high-dimensional complex valued vectors is very useful for representing the equivariances or the part about the transformation. So, for example, if we want to represent a variable x, such as the shift or position of where something is, then we start with a base vector where these omegas are initially randomly assigned, and then you multiply by each of those exponents by that variable x. And one way to think about this, the way it's encoding that variable x, is that as we advance the value of x, then each of these different phasors is rotating at a different rate depending on the value of omega. And so jointly, if I just look at two of these phasors together, I'm moving around the surface of a two-dimensional torus. And in general, if I have an n-dimensional vector, I'm moving around an n-dimensional torus. Okay, and a nice property of encoding things this way is that the similarity kernel, that is the inner product between vectors, these high-dimensional vectors, obeys this property where vectors are orthogonal for different integers, and then it falls off monotonically for these subinteger points in between, for subinteger shifts. Another nice property that pops out of it that we desire is that we can do algebraic operations like addition very simply. So if we bind these two vectors together to a Hadamard product, so that's just an element-wise product of these two vectors, then that corresponds to adding the variables that they represent. All right, so then the next thing we want to be able to do is make this system so it can hold a representation of a position, like that bump attractor, that bump we saw in the ellipsoid body of the fly. So if we want it to hold, we have to have attractor dynamics to do that. So that even if I remove the sensory input, which is also the case in the fly, if you have it in darkness, it still maintains that internal representation of where it's heading in the world. Okay, so this is a very common way of doing this in the field is with attractor neural networks. This is just basically a Hopfield network that is now using complex phasors as the variables instead of binary, +1 and -1. Okay, so then the idea is that this will be an attractor if in this matrix Z, we store these different integers that we want to be stable fixed points. But if we want to have a very large dynamic range, if we want to scale this up, we're going to have a very large memory to store all these different positions to make it a stable attractor, make it robust for all these different positions. And so this is where more inspiration from biology comes in. And this is another astounding, I think, discovery we've made in neuroscience over the past, in this case, 2 decades. It was about 20 years ago that this was first discovered in the entorhinal cortex, these grid cells that have these multimodal firing fields. So each of these shows you the firing where a specific neuron fires in 2D space as the rat wanders around in its environment. And one of the striking things about these grid cells is that not only are they multimodal, they're not firing just in one location, but at multiple locations, where those locations are arranged very nicely into a hexagonal lattice, and they come in different spatial scales. Okay, and they're discrete scales. So there's a group of neurons that has one spacing to them, and there's a sudden jump to another scale, and another scale, and another scale, sort of a fine scale and coarse scale and scales in between. Whoops, I'm sorry. Okay. And so E. Lafitte made, I think, the very provocative suggestion about a decade ago that what might be going on here is that the brain is using a residue number system to encode where it is in space. And this would be an efficient way of taking a very large dynamic range that it needs to represent a spatial position and breaking it down into a set of smaller numbers with smaller dynamic range. Okay, so this is the brilliant work of Chris Kim, which I am going to be bragging about for the next, I don't know, many years, I think, because I'm just so amazed with it. So Chris is here today and can answer more questions about it. But first of all, just introduce the idea of residue numbers. So what you do with a residue number system is you represent a number in terms of its remainder with respect to a set of base numbers. Okay, so for example, with respect to the moduli or base numbers 3, 5, and 7, you would represent the number 41 as 41 mod 3, which is 2, 41 mod 5, which is 1, and 41 mod 7, which is 6. Okay, so the representation of 41 in this residue number system would be 2, 1, 6. And the nice thing about this is as long as you choose moduli that are co-prime, then the range of numbers that you represent is the product of these different moduli. So it's going to scale exponentially. So you can have several numbers with relatively small dynamic range. And in this case, you can get a total dynamic range of 105 out of just these smaller numbers. The other remarkable and nice property of residue numbers is that their addition is done element-wise with no carry operations. So you just add these numbers directly in their column. There's no interaction between these numbers in terms of a carry operation. So you can just parallelize all these operations. Okay, so the next thing we have to figure out, so this was, again, suggested by E. Lafitte about 10 years ago in a paper with Srinivasan. It was really a very cool idea. And so what Chris figured out is how to take these residue numbers and represent them as high-dimensional vectors, high-dimensional complex valued vectors. And the way you do that is pretty much the same way before, except now these phases are chosen from a discrete probability distribution, from a set of discrete points along the unit circle. And so if you want it to be mod 7, then you choose these points uniformly spaced, 7 points along the unit circle here as your phases, and you can just choose them randomly, but uniformly from those discrete points. And the resulting similarity kernel now has your desired modulo property. So once you've gone a distance of 7, you come back to where you started. Okay, it just sort of wraps around on itself very naturally. And then you can now form a composite number by binding these together, by multiplying the residue numbers for each of those different moduli together element-wise. So that's what's being done here. So we have here's the vector representation for the modulo 3, modulo 5, modulo 7. I'm sorry, yeah, that's modulo 3, that's modulo 5, modulo 7 being multiplied together element-wise. And so when you do that, and now advance x, you take that value of x and simply advance it, then what you're going to get here is each of these moduli here is simply sort of spinning around, 3 steps in the circle, 5 steps in the circle is 7. And when you multiply them together, we're going to get a range of 105. So you're going to get basically 105 distinct decodable states from this compound, from this resulting vector over here, which has the same dimensionality as any one of these vectors here. Okay, so then the final thing is to put this into an attractor neural network. So we can have an attractor for each of those residue vectors, which holds a state in it. But now we want all the different residue numbers to play together and be consistent with a single global number. And so that's being basically done in this equation here. It's an attractor neural network where what's being fed in the right side is not simply z, but basically something that's consistent, a z which is consistent with all the other estimated factors and our composite vector p. Okay, so this is basically p divided by all the other factors and then fed through this matrix z to estimate the next state of the ith moduli. Okay, I know I'm having to go through this relatively quickly, but I think I'll summarize this slide by saying it works amazingly well. And so what this enables you to do is build a neural system, a population of neurons that now can, and we can do this in 2 dimensions and code 2D space. I'll have to, I think I want to maybe just end on time. Okay, so basically we have a system that can encode space in 2 dimensions using these residue numbers. It has an attractor neural network structure that binds all these different residue number networks together. So each of them is an attractor on their own, but they work together as a system to encode 2D location. And to my knowledge, I think this is really the first model of the grid cell system, or together with the hippocampal system, that brings these 3 fundamental ideas together: the coding of space with neurons that have these multimodal sort of response fields, the hexagonal spacing, the attractor dynamics, and also leveraging these different scales, these different scales. So we have all these why questions answered in an engineering framework. We have engineering answers to all these different questions, and we have them now working together in one system that can maintain a representation of where it is in the world and do path integration accurately and robustly with systems that are very noisy. The slides that I had to skip through were showing that basically you can just pound the system with noise, have noise in neurons with sort of jitter in their spike timings or whatever they're using to represent those phasors, and it still works very robustly in terms of integrating velocity inputs and estimating, maintaining a position of where it is in space. Okay, so I think I will wrap it up there, and so I think the main points I want to leave you at in terms of maybe helping to bridge this gap between AI and biology and neuroscience and psychology is to say that if we want to sort of get insights from biology in AI, or we want AI to somehow contribute back and give us insights in biology, then we have to be solving the same problem. And one way to gain insight about the problems of biology is to look at animal behavior, okay, including us. Okay, we're one of those animals, but there's many other animals out there, and this is really sort of the way to just define the problem landscape. And once we've defined the problem, things like here, equivariance and invariance or factorization is the problem, then looking inside brains and looking at things like the natural ability of neurons to do multiplication of signals, to have attractor dynamics and recurrent computation, and to do phaser coding can be exploited as solutions to those problems. And then finally, the mathematical structure really provides the computational foundations. And so this is what allows us to build these systems efficiently, leveraging things like Lie groups, residue number systems, and high dimensional vectors. Okay, I know that was a lot, but I will be happy to take questions. And Chris is here to answer more. Yeah.
We have time for just a few questions. Looks like we have a lot of questions.
Yeah, Bill. Is that Bill? Yeah.
I just I'm so struck by well, let me just give an analogy. Like, cicadas come out in prime numbered years, 13 years.
Oh.
And it seems like about prime numbers ability to just makes a lot of sense because they would have survival value by coming out as prime numbers, and so that's how it comes about. Similarly, it would be really nice to come up with a mechanism, like what's an algorithm where you start out not knowing what you're doing, but then have these things arrive at these residue number systems through lots of trial.
Yeah. No, that would be a fantasy of mine, I think, to show that this kind of residue spacing emerges from the desire to have a large dynamic range with the least number of resources. Right. It just seems it fits so well once I heard Hila first describe these ideas, and now that Chris has put it together, it's hard. You never know. It's hard to conceive of any other way of doing it, but that's one of the ultimate tests. If we could have the system self-organize into that structure.
Yeah. Right. The hexagonal place cell measurements, they're arrayed with kind of the spatial frequency of this prime.
Well, I think it's like, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, I would say it's consistent, right? So you could, I think in terms of the exact spacing, there's a ratio between them, an approximate ratio, and it's kind of noisy. So I think if you squinted, you could probably make the residue numbers that you want work. But that's I don't know, Chris, what would you say?
Yeah, like the experimental evidence suggests just like a geometric ratio of the different scales between different group cells. And it's like about like if you squint at like square root of 2 or something like that. But I mean, these are experimental kind of measurements for grid cell measures.
I was playing around with some numbers, and they can come out.
Resolution, to be clear.
Yeah.
Square root of 2 ratio.
Yes.
It seems pretty different than a prime number decomposition for residual, or maybe
I would say that like the two are to be decoupled, or you can have one property without the other, because the property that you need for the residue number system is just that the numbers are co-prime relative to each other. And as long as that problem is fulfilled, you can pick things with roughly equal moduli, or you can have things roughly at a geometric scale. There's different computational.
They don't have to be adjacent primes,
Yeah.
for example, right? So you can you have some freedom to pick them as you want them. Yeah. All right. Yeah.
So this is great. So one question I have is, to what extent do you believe that the lineage of how these biological structures evolve is important, on this quest as well? Or is that, you think, maybe not as important in your view?
I would say it's super. I think it would be super informative if you knew that, if you could figure it out. That's one of the things that fascinates me about looking at the spiders and the flies. The fly has this internal representation of heading. My goodness, that just kind of really says, okay, it opens up the gates and says, well, maybe everything from there on does, and so I think it's, in terms of your thinking about what's possible, what's feasible in biology and the whole picture, yes, I think that lineage is very helpful to have.
So my question is connected to this, but is it really reasonable to assume that a mechanism is preserved over phylogeny, in the sense that it could be that different mechanisms are used in brains of size 100 neurons and size 100 billion neurons and in between? So give an example. I mean, so certainly the capability that you described in navigation of path integration, we have versions of that in humans and so on, right? So it's there across brains of size 100 neurons and size 10 to the 11 neurons. But take an example of locomotion. So central pattern generators are very common, and they enable, and it's related to your phasers, and it enables walking to develop with very few neuron networks. But with human babies, they develop walking much later in ways which do not seem to correspond to the pattern generator. So the pattern generator is there, and even fetuses show behavior of moving legs in a periodic way. But when a child learns to walk at the age of 11 months or 12 months, they're doing it in a very different way. Humans are not the opposite of precocial, and the movement, the process is much more learned rather than driven by innate mechanisms and so on. So anyway, do you have any comment?
Yeah, absolutely. I would not lay down the fly as the template for how any animal is going to do navigation. I mean, we had plenty of examples of convergent evolution. So maybe another system could get to that same solution through a completely different route and lineage, or a different solution for that matter, right? And so like the head direction cells are known to exist in rats, but they're not arranged in a nice ring anatomically as they are on a fly. And it maybe, who knows, if the computational principle is the same. But I would just I look at it as more as an existence proof. The fact that it can happen there so robustly. And this is the thing that Yvette Fisher here at UC Berkeley has explained to me, that bump is extremely stable and dark. So you turn off all the lights. If it's not moving, if it's not changing its orientation, that bump of activity is rock solid. It's not kind of like moving around like Brownian motion or something like that. It is very stable. So it's really a kind of a remarkable testament to the neural structures there. Yeah. Okay. Oh, yeah.
One more question. Yeah. We'll do more at the breaks and so forth. But Lewis, for you, why don't you
Set up. Yeah.
So, quick question, Bruno. So how important is it to you that for these residual number systems, if you want to